Hey, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about making our drone chase the player. So this will involve pawn navigation and also a navigation mesh. And we'll see how the navigation mesh is used by pawns when allowing them to navigate on their own using AI. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm back here in my project, and I'd like to start doing some pawn navigation, which means we need something called a nav mesh. Now, if we go to Place Actors and search for nav mesh, we see something called a nav mesh bounds volume. Now, if we drag one of these in, we see that it's in the shape of a box, and we can drag it down so that box is overlapping with the ground. And if we press the P key on our keyboard, we see the actual mesh. It's this green area that's generated, and this is needed for any AI in our game. Wherever the green mesh exists, that's where AI can do all the necessary calculations for navigating throughout our level. So we want this covering every inch of our level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my camera speed up to a high value so I can zoom all the way up above my entire level, and I'm going to cover this whole thing with the nav mesh. So I'm going to move it to the center here, hit the R key, and scale it on up. I want to scale it so that all the geometry is going to be covered by the green area. Now, once we know that our nav mesh covers all of the main areas, we don't need to see it anymore. But before I press the P key to hide it again, I'm just going to show you how there are some objects that break the mesh. When the mesh is broken like this, our AI cannot travel through those areas. And so we'll see things like these cracks and the edges alongside meshes, things like that. This determines whether or not the AI can pass through those areas. And we see that our nav mesh actually doesn't cover every inch. So we can change our nav mesh settings so that we don't have these gaps like this. So to alter our nav mesh settings, we can go to Edit and Project Settings and scroll down to Navigation Mesh. Let's go ahead and select that. And we can scroll down and we see there are some generation settings here. And we can alter these. For one, we can change the cell height. We see that it's at 10. Now, if I undock the project settings here, I can see that cell height is 10, and this is what it looks like. But if I increase the cell height by dragging, we'll see that that green area is raising and it's above that sidewalk there. So that's sort of what we want so we don't have any cracks in our nav mesh. So that's looking a lot better already. So we can set cell height to a value of about 100. Now I'm going to close project settings and I now see that our nav mesh is looking a lot better. Okay, so we have a navigation mesh, but we'd like to make our drone chase the player. And our drone can't move unless it has a way to move. And one of the ways we can make it move is giving it a movement component, much like our character has. So back here in our pawn, we can add a movement component, and our pawn wants to float around. And there just happens to be a special movement component designed for floating pawns. It's called Floating Pawn Movement Component. So we can add a floating pawn movement component to our pawn. And now once we program our pawn to move, it will use variables stored in this movement component to determine the nature of that movement. So let's talk about how we're going to make our drone pawn move. Now, there are many ways to make AI move around in Unreal Engine. One way is to use an AI Move To node. As you can see, AI Move To takes a pawn, and that's the pawn that is actually doing the AI moving. If we're calling this function from within the drone pawn, we can pass in a reference to self. You can always get a reference to self by right-clicking and typing self. We'll pass that in. And it also takes a destination as a vector or a target actor. In our case, we can pass in our goal actor, which is the character that's overlapping with that overlap sphere. So the most important parts to this node are passing in a reference to self, passing in a goal actor, and notice we see an acceptance radius. Now, this is the distance away from us the pawn will stop before it reaches us, so we can adjust that as well. So for the challenge, I'd like you to make the drone chase the character. Use the AI Move To node and do this in our overlap event. use the goal actor variable that we have for the target actor. And for the pawn, pass in a reference to self. And then adjust the acceptance radius as you see fit. Pause the video and give this a try. All right, I'm going to go back into drone pawn and drag off of goal actor and type AI move to. And I'm going to use an AI move to node. Now, again, pawn needs to be self. So we're going to get a reference to self and pass that in. And for the target actor, we can simply pass in goal actor. That's going to be our character. Now, I'm going to leave acceptance radius at 5 and see how this works. Let's go ahead and compile and save and go back to the level. And I notice I still have that sphere up there. I'm going to go ahead and select that and remove that. Okay, so let's give this a try. I'm going to hit play and overlap with this sphere. And whoa, that is a kind of scary thing. The drone is just zooming right in towards us, which is pretty scary. So we may want to set that acceptance radius to a higher value. And we also might want to set our drone pawn's overlap sphere to be larger so that we can have the drone chase us before we get super, super close. So I'm going to set this to, say, 1200. And I'm going to go back and set that acceptance radius to 100. And let's see how that looks. Let's go back, hit play. And of course, we're already overlapping from the beginning, so I'm going to need to move this pawn out, away, say over there. Now I can hit play and overlap, and here comes the pawn. So that looks great. All right, so now we can aggro the drone. We can make it angry and have it chase us when we get too close. So this is a great next step. We're now ready to start making our drones dangerous. And we'll do that in the videos to come. I'll see you soon.